5. And they thought there was more, but they'd found 5. And when I said 5, what is his 5 dead bodies?
It was the first indication that there was somebody on Ward 4 who was prepared to injure and kill children.
On scenes of crime, carers who kill. A butler and a nurse turned to murder. In 1978, a hotel in the wilds of northern Scotland was the scene where a bizarre series of crimes finally came to an end. On the 16th of January, 2 smartly dressed men checked into the Blenheim House Hotel. Owner Michael White was not happy with his 2 guests. All was not as it seemed with them.
They offered Mrs. White and I a drink. We didn't have one, but they had a drink before they went in for dinner, and then had a bottle of wine with their dinner. And the strange thing about the bottle of wine was they insisted on paying for the wine rather than have it put on their bill with their dinner. I thought it very strange at the time, but fortunately I got the price of the wine. I never got the price of the dinner. Now, my wife is not a suspicious person, far from it, but she said, I don't like the look of these chappies either. I don't care for them at all. And I phoned the police.
PC Mike Webster was called to the hotel. He was asked to check out the men and their car. He had no idea of what he was about to discover.
The first indication was that it's maybe just somebody that's going to do a board and lodgings fraud, nice hotel, obtain a meal and then disappear during the morning.
Police arrived and checked the car. They found its number plate didn't match the description. Archibald Hall and Michael Keto were taken away to be interviewed.
They came to the station at our request quite comfortably, and as the night progressed, Mr. Hall went to the toilet, maybe once, twice, but always returned. On one occasion I had mentioned to Mr. Keto, is there something wrong with him? And he said, he's had a stomach upset and what have you. And then on the 3rd occasion he never came back. It was at that Mr. Keto was restrained and placed into a cell.
Hall panicked and tried to get away. Police set up roadblocks and caught him in a taxi taking him to Edinburgh. Within hours of his arrest, Keto confessed his involvement.
My shift inspector said, do you know what's in the boot of the car? I said, no, that we hadn't searched the car. And so the boot was opened and there was a naked male body lying in the boot with a bag over its head.
Police arrested Hall and Keto on suspicion of murder. The investigation revealed a horrific trail of deceit and violence. Douglas Skelton is a journalist and author who's written extensively on the case of the smooth-talking conmen.
Hall was basically a petty criminal who'd been in and out of prison for many years. He was a smooth talker, a charmer. He was an intelligent man. He was a con man, but he never really hit the big time. He didn't have the big sting. In the most profitable period of his life, if you like, is when he posed as a butler or a gentleman's gentleman, which is what eventually led him to becoming a multiple murderer.
Archibald Hall developed a taste for the good life from an early age. He wanted it by any means. Using forged references, Hall got a job as a butler in Kirkleton Hall, home of Lady Hudson, a wealthy widow living in Dumfries. Hall settled in, all the while planning how to rob Lady Hudson. But before he could finalise his plans, his criminal past caught up with him.
He was contacted by an ex-inmate from prison, David Wright, who was a petty crook and a former lover. He wanted to rob Lady Hudson blind, and he wanted to do it right away. Archibald Hall might have been playing a waiting game. He was taking the longer view. The longer they wait, the more they can get. Wright was a bit of a loose cannon.
Hall and Wright argued about what to do, but Hall had other plans. The argument had sealed Wright's fate. He and Hall went shooting rabbits on Lady Hudson's estate.
Hall and Wright went off into the moors the next morning, and Hall took his chance while Wright was reloading his weapon and shot him.
Wright was shot in the head. There was no turning back. Hall had gone from petty criminal to murderer.
When he disappeared, Hall explained it by saying that Wright had just done a bunk, basically. That would have covered up the fact that he'd disappeared, he was missing, and also if there was anything missing that of Lady Hudson's that Hall didn't know about, he could just say, well, I'm sorry, he must have stolen it. And Hall was fired, and he scuttled off back to London to plan his next big sting.
Using the same scam of forged references, he got a position with the elderly and infirm Captain Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott.
The Scott Elliots were wealthy. Captain Scott Elliott had money. When he married Dorothy, she brought money of her own. They had the apartment in London. They had jewels. They had furs. They had antiques. They had all the Persian carpets. This, for Archibald Hall, would have been the golden opportunity. Here was the golden egg.
Hall immediately began planning to rob the Scott Elliots, but he needed help to do it.
He turned to Mary Cogle, who was one of his many women, and she in turn introduced him to Michael Keto, who was another small-time crook. And together they came up with the plan to fleece the Scott Elliots of as much of their goods as they could possibly do.
Hall thought Mrs. Scott Elliott was away for a few days. He showed Keto around the apartment, planning the robbery.
They had no intentions, and I firmly believe this, of hurting anybody. Unfortunately, that's not the way it worked.
Hall and Keto stumbled into Mrs. Scott Elliott's bedroom, but were surprised to find her in bed reading. Hall grabbed a pillow and suffocated her, helped by Keto. Mr. Scott Elliott was unaware of his wife's murder. He was heavily drugged in bed, and so began another macabre chapter in Hall's plans.
Their original plan was to leave the flat with as much booty as they could. Now they had a dead body. They wrapped her up in a rug and they put the body in the boot of a car. The next problem is, what do we do with Captain Scott Elliott? They had Mary Cogle impersonate Dorothy Scott Elliott, and off they went to the wilds of Scotland. Captain Scott Elliott was under the influence of drugs to help him sleep, and they made sure that he was doped up throughout the entire journey. The entire journey was actually what was left of his life.
They set off on the road to Scotland, with Mrs. Scott Elliott's body in the boot of the car. All the while, Mr. Scott Elliott believed the woman next to him was his wife. They dumped the body of Mrs. Scott Elliott behind a wall, on a remote road in Perthshire. They set off again looking for a suitable place to kill Mr. Scott Elliott and dispose of the body. Hall tried to throttle Mr. Scott Elliott, but he fought back. There was a struggle.
He eventually had the man on the ground, his foot on the man's windpipe, and he shouted to Keto to hit him over the head with a shovel, and that's exactly what Keto did. They then dumped the captain's body in a piece of woodland in the glen and came back south. Hall would probably see his golden opportunity evaporating before his eyes. He'd killed 3 people and he had absolutely nothing to show for it.
The motley gang returned to Hall's rented cottage in Newton Arlish near Carlisle to lie low for a while.
Hall wanted to get rid of some of the stuff that they'd taken from the Scott Elliott's house. He felt that it was a pointer directly to them. Mary Cogle, however, had grown attached to the jewels and the furs that they had taken, in particular a mink coat. There were arguments. Hall wanted rid of them, she said no. Eventually, Hall's next step was the now common step of, if I can't reason with somebody, then I'll just get rid of them.
Hall grabbed a poker and beat Mary Cogle unconscious. He and Keto then strangled her. They put her body in the boot of the car, set off again, and dumped her in a stream near Lockerbie. Hall and Keto spent Christmas with Hall's family near Blackpool. There they began to plan their next robbery. But Hall's younger brother Donald wanted a piece of the action.
Donald, I'm afraid, wasn't as clever as Archibald was. And basically he just became an irritation. He asked too many questions. He wanted to know too much. And Archibald Hall must have recognised him as yet another liability.
Hall used to talk his way out of trouble. Now he was prepared to kill his way out. He and Quito drowned Donald in the bath of the cottage in Newton Arlish. Now Hall and Quito had to decide what to do with the fifth body. They put Donald's body in the boot of a hire car with false number plates, drove to North Berwick to the Blenheim House Hotel, and checked in while they decided what to do. It all ended when two plausible-looking, well-dressed men arrived at this hotel. Norman White had no idea that his two suspicious guests were multiple murderers.
The CID came in. He said to me that they'd found 5, and they thought there was more, but they'd found 5, and when I said 5 what, he says 5 dead bodies. And the pen just fell out my hand there and then.
Hall was sentenced to life with a recommendation that he never be released. Quito got 15 years.
They were caught purely by chance. If it hadn't been for that hotel owner being suspicious of them, if it hadn't been for the police turning up and eventually opening the boot and finding Donald Hall's body, they might have gone on further. I think Quito certainly would have been next on the list. He would have had to go.
I think it's always difficult to get your head around why people kill. And in this particular case, it was even worse, because normally there is some tangible reason for a killing.
Grantham, Lincolnshire, 1991. The local district hospital was the scene of a number of disturbing and tragic attacks. Patients on the children's ward were being made ill, and in a number of cases killed, by one of the nurses supposedly caring for them. David Crampton's baby son Paul was a patient on Ward 4.
My wife had taken Paul to the hospital because he had an infection which turned out to be bronchiolitis. He was taken into hospital because he was a 5-month-old baby and they were being careful, and I'd gone off to do some shopping with our other 2 children and returned expecting to find Paul well and happy because he was going out of hospital the next day, to find him cradled in a nurse's arms in a cold, clammy condition, sweating and very lethargic, and to be told that the doctor had been called and was on his way. This was on a Saturday evening. Paul suffered what was then diagnosed as a hypoglycemic attack, which is low blood sugar basically. He suffered 1 attack on the Saturday, a second on the following Sunday, and then a third on the Thursday following that. He had a chest infection. This was now a life-threatening matter.
Due to the seriousness of Paul's condition, he was transferred to the better-equipped Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham. And once he was admitted there, he made a very rapid recovery. But his parents were still extremely concerned.
Right from the beginning of the first attack, which was on the Saturday, right at the beginning my wife was very clear this was an outside influence. This was not a medical problem with Paul. Something was influencing Paul's illness. She believed at that time that actually it was a cocktail of drugs, that somehow there'd been a mistake, that the drugs they were given in hospital had somehow had an adverse reaction. She was very close to being right, of course.
Between February and April 1991, 4 children died and at least 10 others suffered similar attacks, to the horror of the staff at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. No one could explain why. Detective Superintendent Stuart Clifton was called in by the medical staff to investigate.
Nobody could really understand why it was occurring, because although they were ill children, they were ill with relatively minor medical conditions, the sort of thing that one expects over a winter period, and they were expected to recover without any real difficulty. And so it was alarming, I think, for all of the hospital staff to find children that were suddenly dying on them.
All of the victims' medical histories were investigated, but it was blood tests taken from Paul Crampton that would prove to be the key evidence. They showed abnormally high levels of insulin in his blood, so much so that it had to have been injected deliberately.
So here was the first indication that there was somebody on Ward 4 who was prepared to injure and kill children. We decided that we would concentrate all our enquiries on this little boy, whilst at the same time looking at the overall picture to see if there was any one constant factor present when all of these children either died or collapsed.
The Cramptons were still struggling to come to terms with what had happened to their son. They wanted an explanation.
It's very difficult to sleep at night because obviously we were concerned that he might have a further hypoglycemic attack during the night, and it took a few days before we were starting to become inquisitive again and asking the medical profession why this had happened and had they got back the test results. And before I'd managed to make that, the police rang and asked if they could come and see me. And at that time they told me that they believed our son's illness was a result of some outside influence. That explained an awful lot very quickly.
Police told the Cramptons that they had proof that Paul had been injected with huge amounts of insulin. Incredibly, this evidence showed that the person responsible had to be one of the hospital staff.
The incident room produced a graph that showed that the one common factor to all of these deaths and collapses was a nurse working on the ward, Beverley Allitt. She was the only nurse who was on duty at the bedside of each and every child that either died or collapsed. And some of these children collapsed a number of times, not just once.
The police interviewed Beverley Allitt at length. Her responses were puzzling and disturbing.
3 weeks into the inquiry, by about the end of May, I made the decision that we would arrest Beverley Allitt and interview her with regard to our suspicions. Well, most of the nursing staff, when questioned, would be angry or tearful and would display some emotion, whether you expected it or didn't from that particular individual. With Beverley Allitt, there was no emotion whatsoever, and we found that extremely difficult to understand. She was cold, she was calculating. From the outset, she didn't come across as one would expect of a young, frightened nurse. The interview took place over a couple of days and produced little or nothing, or at least that is what we thought at the time. She was subsequently released on bail without charge.
Police had no concrete evidence against Beverley Allitt. The families of Allitt's victims were becoming frustrated at the lack of progress. They contacted solicitor Anne Alexander, whose firm specialises in clinical negligence cases.
I was met by a barrage of parents who were very angry. I advised them that we could bring a private prosecution against her, and we decided to hold a press conference to announce that if the police were not in a position to bring charges, that is what we would be willing to do. I am a mother, and I had a great strength of feeling for what those families have been going through, because when I think you are a mother, I think you do have very different feelings. We held the press conference, and it might have been that which persuaded the Director of Public Prosecutions to then bring charges. I don't think there was any doubt that it was going to happen. I think it was more a question of the speed with which it was going to happen, and these families just felt that things had been dragging on and nothing was happening. That the families were very concerned that if this had happened in that hospital and there'd been a series of attacks over a period of time, then how easy would it have been for something like that to be happening in other hospitals around the country? So one of the other things that was terribly important for them was to have an inquiry into what had gone on, to make sure that lessons could be learned.
Meanwhile, Stuart Clifton and the Lincolnshire police had been able to gather all the evidence they needed to finally convict Beverley Allitt.
What later became significant was, at the time of her arrest, we found in her possession a little notebook called the Allocations Book. Didn't at the time realise its significance, but this was a book that was completed by the nurse in charge of the children's ward, and it showed which nurse had been allocated to which patient, and quite clearly put Beverley Allitt as responsible for each of these patients that had either collapsed or died. She, realising this, had obviously stolen it from the hospital and had taken it home. So here was just another little bit of evidence that indicated that we had the right girl. What became increasingly apparent was that she liked the kudos of being the nurse that discovered these childs in attack, that on virtually every occasion Allitt would shout out, "I've got a child here that's collapsed, that is blue and arching."
Beverley Allitt was put on trial in 1993. Her behaviour in court was strange.
I thought she was very cold while she was in court and uncaring. There were people giving evidence that was very emotional. I felt very emotional at times, even though obviously I knew all of these stories. But she tended to just stare ahead and sit there.
She never explained why she did it. One can only make assumptions, and the assumption of the experts was that she was suffering from Munchausen by proxy, which is a condition where you as the carer cause injury so that you get the kudos for caring. If that's the reason, I think it's quite sad that a number of children had to suffer death and collapse to satisfy Beverley Allitt.
Though Allitt pleaded not guilty, she was convicted of 4 murders, 3 attempted murders, and 6 counts of grievous bodily harm. She was given 13 life sentences and sent to Rampton Hospital, a psychiatric institution, where she has remained ever since.
You have to believe that anyone who commits such horrendous crimes is ill and is suffering from some form of illness. You know, that has to be the explanation that's acceptable. There can't be another acceptable explanation. And we mustn't allow events like Allitt giving a bad opinion of the vast majority of people who work in the medical profession and look after people who are ill in a very, very caring way.